cases by these paisiers, and were people who were the city organized that, and they settled. And if you see in the statistics from the 15th century on, the activity of the paisiers decreased, and that was due to the reforms imposed by the Burgundian Duke. Now you can say, so in this sense, the blood feuding system and the violence involved in the blood feuding system was minimalized in the cities. You can say, well, if you compare with the state organized criminal law, is that better? Well, you should not have a too angelic view on this state criminal law in that time. If you see the methods which were used in the criminal law, then probably this system, this civilized system of blood feuding, was much more humane than the criminal law system of that time. And that's quite also a very interesting thing. A last point is the cities, the medieval cities, were also militarily very successful. They had no standing army. But the guilds had militias, and the militias were used for policing at night. The guilds had a kind of turns of patrolling in the city. So there was no standing police, and there was no standing army either. The guilds had the obligation, when the city was attacked, when they had to go to war, to deliver a number of men, and that were the militias. Now, these militias were very successful. I mentioned 3 very important battles in Europe, where the city militias really beat the feudal armies of the kings. First, you had the Battle of Legnano, 1176, where the militias of the North Italian cities beat the army of the German emperor, and by this they became nearly independent. You have the Battle of Kortrijk, 1302, where basically the army of the Flemish were basically city militias, mostly from Bruges. Bruges delivered the bulk of the militias. Ghent, some, but not too much, so there is a tradition in Ghent not to be on the forefront of the Flemish independence. And then you have the Battle of Morgarten of 1315, where the Swiss militias beat the army of the Habsburg emperor. So you see a military shift in Europe in favor of the city militias, and they were able, without any standing army, to raise a well-organized army in order to defend their liberties. Okay, and then a last point is taxation. Did the cities have taxation? Yes. But the taxation, if we look into the archives of Bruges, we have all the accounts. The accounts are studied. The taxation level was extremely low, and also the bureaucracy, the people working for the city government was kept really to a minimum. Most things were done by the free associations like the guilds and so on. In Ghent, Ghent had in the 14th century 60,000 inhabitants, and the number of people working for the city was 70. 70 people were working for the city, and then you have to realize that a lot of tasks which are now done by the government, by the central government, were done by the city. The city was the most important government. 70 people. All the other public tasks were done by free association. And you see, and then also in many cases the rich people in the city often monopolized the city government and were then taxing people, and that led to conflicts between the common people and the patricians. A very important shift in Flanders was in 1302 in Ghent. In Ghent, the patricians took the side of the French, and the commoners the side of the Flemish. And after the Battle of Kortrijk, a lot of patricians were murdered in Ghent or were expelled and moved to France. So there were quite sometimes bloody revolts. But what was the general result of this tension in most cities, like in Flanders and then later in Brabant, and also in Italy? A kind of democracy was instituted. The city government had to ask money to the citizens. The citizens said, okay, we want to pay for some public purposes, but we want to discuss about that. We want to discuss about that. And in order to create a forum for this discussion, a kind of democratic system, representation, in Ghent it was called the collatie, was created. So you see, if you have small government and small entities, that also democracy will be promoted. And in this sense, the cities are also the earliest centers of democracy in Europe. Later on, of course, this autonomy and this democracy was largely reduced due to the introduction of a centralized state, absolute monarchy. But the spirit of freedom from the medieval cities lasted and remained in the European intellectual tradition. Some countries were able to maintain this large autonomy of the cities. The United Republic, for instance, United Republic is Holland. There the cities kept their medieval autonomy. But for instance, in Flanders, the autonomy was largely reduced. The autonomy of Ghent was reduced by a guy born in Ghent, Charles V. But of course, the introduction of absolute monarchy reduced a lot this centralization. But as I said, this tradition of polycentrism, of liberty of the citizens, remained in the European tradition and contributed to a large extent to the liberal revolutions we had in the 18th and 19th century. Further lessons for that, it's up to you to draw them, but I would say libertarians should always fight for decentralization, but not only decentralization of spending, but also of decentralization of taxation. What you spend, you should in fact find in the taxation of your own constituency. And in this sense, the autonomy the Flemish communities have is largely a autonomy of spending. And the decentralization of spending leads to even more spending of the state in total. If you look, for instance, where you have where the increase of bureaucrats has been the most the last years in Flanders, it's not the Belgian federal state. In fact, the Belgian federal state diminished its number of bureaucrats. Flanders increased it a lot, but the last year it stagnated. But if you look to the communities, to the cities, the communities and the provinces, there you see a boom of bureaucrats, and that's of course because these cities can tap the resources given to them by the central government. So that is, I think, a very important lesson. Individual liberty is very important, but in politics, decentralization and fiscal responsibility for the decentralized unit is also very conducive for liberty and keeping the state power in check. And with this, I stop. I have spoken. 45 minutes, that's too long, maybe, but I am ready to take your questions.
So, any questions? Christophe?
Boudewijn. So for many decades, the cities have actually been the driving powers behind the emancipation and liberalization of behind the emancipation of mankind, the citizens. But for now, I think all the major cities in Europe are governed by a left-wing socialist people. There is an increase of poverty in the cities, an increase of poverty. So how will we how can we regain power in the cities?
I have to make some jumps. First, why I think we could say, well, in the Middle Ages the cities were the driving forces of progress, and now they are the driving forces of conservatives, because they are really the powers, the centers of strength of socialism and the welfare state. Of course, the changing. I don't think this picture should be generalized. Still, cities are the centers of economic development and innovation, especially what I call the productive cities. You have consumptive cities and productive cities. Antwerp is a productive city. It produces a lot. Brussels is a consumptive city. The wealth of Brussels is based on the spending of tax money. While Antwerp, for instance, I don't know what's the case in Ostend, but I fear the balance is not so positive. But you have productive cities and you have consumptive cities. But these large administrative centers like in France, you have the same. Lyon is a productive city. It yields a lot of tax money. Paris is a tax-consuming city. So you have different types of city. But of course, if you see to the population of the cities, a lot of people living from welfare and social security flock into cities. Ostend is very known for that, a lot of pensioners coming. Why is that? Well, first, the cities cannot control access to the city. City cannot say, you cannot come and live here. The medieval cities had this control. They were a community. They were owning the public space as a community, and they could say, you don't get in. So they had, here you have free access. And then, of course, if you're living from an allowance given to you by the state, by the social security system, you don't have to look for work for an employer. So it's always better to get your allowance and enjoy your allowance in a city where you have a lot of public spaces, a lot of amenities, than, for instance, in the countryside. In France, a lot of people flock to the south, people living from allowances, because if you're pensioned or you're living from some allowance for sickness and so on, it's better to enjoy it under the sun than in the rain. In the rain of Lille, of the sun of Aix-en-Provence. So there is a pressure that all these people. In Belgium, if you have pension, you don't have to look to an employer. Where do you go? To Ostend. You have good air, the sun, you meet Jean-Marie de Decker, and so on. So you have, that's clear that if you don't have to care for an employer, you flock into the cities. And then also you have immigration, the immigrants. That is a classical phenomenon. Immigrants first go to the cities because they have their networks over there. Most immigrants go to a place where there are already immigrants of their region, where they can have some mutual support. So it's very natural that the immigrants first go to cities and spread later out. And of course, a lot of immigrants, and that's a